Doctor. Well, we'll formally get started in just a few minutes, but while we do, just want to get, so everyone gets an idea. Some joined us during the day today. Can everyone from TROSA stand up and raise your hands? Okay. So we'll get to hear more from TROSA tomorrow, but came from North Carolina, you know, the Triangle Research Area between Raleigh and Durham, and got started by Kevin McDonald, a Delancey graduate. We have some people from Red Barn. We have Red Barn stand up. They're here in the back. So many of us will get to have a chance to go visit and tour Red Barn tomorrow night, have dinner there. We're so glad you guys are here with us today. We have people from Soul Recovery. You want to stand up? From Soul Recovery is from Pennsylvania, and we are so grateful for our new friends that we've gotten to know over the last couple of years. We have Harvest Academy. You want to stand up? Harvest Academy is located in Des Moines, Iowa, and we're really glad that you guys could make it out here. We have John Vulcan Academy. We're so grateful. They've got campuses in British Columbia, in the Seattle area, and in Phoenix. And we have some people from the Other Side Academy. Everyone from the Other Side Academy want to stand up? Yeah. Ted Sexton from Phoenix House. Interesting that Dr. De Leon helped with Phoenix House in the early days. I know we've got a group from Alaska. You want to stand up? Welcome from Alaska. We've got a group, some people from New York. Where's our New Yorkers? Yeah, right here. And Dr. De Leon. We have a group from the Dakotas, South Dakotas, being strong in the house. We have a group from Oregon. You want to stand up and join us? We have part of our Denver campus leadership here. You want to? And tell me where else, people I've missed, where you've coming from. Oh, we have Habilitat, of course. You know, Habilitat, Delancey and Habilitat were the only two that maintained fidelity of the original TC model. All the rest of us spun out from different portions of the TC. We rely heavily on the Delancey, but Habilitat, started by Vinnie Marino and now being run by Jeff Nash, just a tremendous example of a classic therapeutic community, which we're going to talk about tonight. I want to just, what's that? Oh, and we also have our sister organization called the Other Side Village. And who's here from the village? We got it. So the village is one of our new projects that we're going to be working to help those who are chronically homeless using a therapeutic community model within a permanent housing solution using small cottage homes as housing, but having that community as method approach to maintaining the culture within the community. So right now we're getting ready to start phase 1, which will have 60 homes. Eventually you'll have over 400 homes. So we're really excited to be able to start that project. Who else have we missed in the audience who've come from afar or from locally? All right. LT. All right, thank you so much. My name's Tim Stay. I'm the CEO of the Other Side Foundation. It's the umbrella that oversees both the academy and the village. We'll get a chance to introduce many of you over the next few days. We're so grateful last year, or 2 years ago when we held this, many of you is still in the COVID era, and so many joined by virtual. It's so nice to have all of you here in person. We're really grateful that so many of you have traveled so far to come join us tonight. Just a few items. We have exits here and in the back. Bathrooms are over here behind this wall on the far wall. And tomorrow we're going to get started at 8:30. If you want to join us for a morning meeting, that's at 7:15, right, Dave? Yes. 7:15. Morning meeting, 7:15. Breakfast starts at 6:30. If you want to join us for breakfast, come at 6:30. But the official sessions will be here at 8:30, when we'll start. And we'll go till 5. Then we'll help transport people to Red Barn Academy. We've got room for a selected number of people to stay for breakthrough groups, and I think Kathy's been reaching out to people to make sure we only have a limited number of spots, so we want to make sure the people who really want to be there. Otherwise, we encourage you to go see another great therapeutic community at Red Barn, it's about 20 miles up the road from here. And then on Saturday, we'll go from 8:30 to 5 again on Saturday with another full day of great sessions. This conference has been focused on trying to share challenges and best practices among practitioners. We know a number of you are here trying to learn about the model, so we'll try to encourage that, but we've really tried to focus about issues that practitioners are dealing with, how to recruit, how to retain, how to deal with issues, and hopefully in that process you'll get to learn some of that. We will have a panel tomorrow that will, for those who are wanting to try to replicate or modify their program, it will be during lunch tomorrow, so we'll have some people who've either expanded recently or launched new facilities. Beyond that paddle will be a working lunch. That's going to be on Saturday, the working lunch. And with that, I want to talk a little bit about, we've called this a classic therapeutic community summit. To understand that, we need to understand what a therapeutic community is. Let me pull this up. So first, it's important to understand what a therapeutic community is, and one of the key components is that a therapeutic community focuses on whole person change. It isn't just saying let's get people drug-free, let's get them, out of, it's how do you completely change and reinvent yourself to be able to have a different life going forward. And it's not about just drug abstinence or avoidance of criminal behavior. It involves figuring out how to be right living, encourages participants to examine their personal behavior to help them become more pro-social, engage in right living, honesty, taking responsibility, hard work, willingness to learn. These attitudes and behaviors, the underlying attitudes and behaviors that led to the addiction, that led to the criminal behavior, focusing on those things so so you can learn how to live, and then practicing it for a long time. And sometimes you don't feel like it, so that's where act as if, act as if you're still polite, and act as if have a good attitude. And if you do that long enough, it starts to become who you are. So right living is an important part. There's stages of progression in the model where you move through change, and as you move through change, you get more privileges, more responsibility, and getting ready to re-enter society as you get being able to show that I have changed enough to be able to handle the pressures of life after being in the program. It takes a community as method approach, which phrase was coined by Dr. De Leon, and the community as method versus medicine as a method, or psychotherapy as the method of healing. Community is the core method of healing for a therapeutic community. Now, that's not saying that you can't bolt on some of these other services. I know TROSA has bolted on mental health, but that's not the primary method of healing. Still, community is the primary method of healing with these added services, which some therapeutic communities have chosen to do. Lola, I remember early on, told me about an experience she had at Delancey Street where she was having troubles, and she got the advice, Lola, your medicine is in the dining room. And I said, what does that mean, Lola? And she said, the way to heal is to find how to connect to people. Go into the dining room, sit down, connect with someone, figure that out. And so the method of healing is by learning how to connect to someone in a meaningful way. Follow the model of each one, teach one, where with the emphasis on this mutual self-help, I'll help you and you help me. When A helps B, A gets better. And so we alternate the power dynamic. In a medical model, you have the expert, the professional, and you have the patient, and it's always different. But in a therapeutic community, at one moment, I'm the teacher and you're the student. The next moment, you're the teacher and I'm the student. You're changing that dynamic, and by doing so, we get better by helping others around us and giving that opportunity not just to always be the patient, always be the recipient of aid. Therapeutic community follows a peer accountability model. We talked about that for those who are here today. We think the three core elements are pull up, pass, and participate in the encounter group or the game. It's important that the therapeutic community is really rigid and really good at the peer accountability model to help create that culture. So these are some of the general elements of a therapeutic community. Joseph earlier today talked about how words can get diluted over time. We find out there in society that different organizations say, oh, we follow a therapeutic community model, and we go in and we visit them and we say, this doesn't look anything like what we understand a therapeutic community model to be. We're not seeing the elements that I just went through. Yeah, they maybe have communal living, and maybe they live in shared housing, and maybe they have, eat together, but they don't practice these core principles that a therapeutic community should have. And so to try to differentiate from this kind of diluted term of just therapeutic, we said we follow the classic therapeutic community model, which has all the elements that I just mentioned, but it has a few others. One, they're long. We see a lot of places say they're therapeutic community, but they're 90 days. How do you have a community as method when it's such a short time frame? How can you practice life? How can you experience whole person change in such? We think it needs to be a long process. Second, we think it needs to, I mentioned this, the community as method is the primary, and that social enterprises drive or cover a significant portion of the revenues, because that's the only model that we've seen that allows it to be long. So a classic therapeutic community. So I think every organization that is a TC that we mentioned today all have elements of these classic models. You look at the early, you look at Gaudentia, you look at Daytop, you look at Amity, you look at Delancey. They all were self-funded in the very early days until they found other sources of revenue. But then those other sources of revenue were part of the contributing factor to dilute their model and lead them off the model. So we think having a significant portion of your revenue self-funded is an important part. Joseph, anything else you would add to what a classic therapeutic? So I just want to give a brief overview so we all understood what we're talking about when we say classic therapeutic community, what a TC is, what a classic TC is. I now want to I know all of us would rather hear from Dr. De Leon. He's been a wonderful friend to us over the years. We're so grateful that he was able to make it out from New York to visit us. He's a psychologist and an academic, was a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the New York University Langone Medical Center. He got his PhD from Columbia University. He conducted all the early Phoenix House studies, researching the mechanisms engaged in the therapeutic community. He researched the Phoenix House for 20 years, from 1967 to 1987. He became intensely involved in the day-to-day of the organization, and he wrote kind of the seminal work in therapeutic communities. If you don't have a copy, highly encourage you. They're pricey, unfortunately, but it's well worth getting that and being able to learn from that. So now we'll turn the time over. We're going to pull up the screen, let Dr. De Leon sit while he presents to us, and we're going to have an opportunity for some Q&A with him as well.
Great.
Okay?
We're going to raise this. This could be a scene on the street, right, or something? Okay, am I okay?
Yeah,
Can you hear me
you're
all
great.
right? All right, forgive me if I have to sit. It's really just a geriatric back, you know what I mean, that's involved. First of all, I want to, I really from my heart say I'm grateful to be here for, among other things, existential reasons, you know what I mean, just to be here is grateful, and so that's something I always stay close to. But also, Tim, for that quick review of the therapeutic community, some of the elements of that. But look, I want to begin my remarks really with kind of an apology, and the apology is it's a diverse room. There are people at all levels of interest and involvement in this process and the therapeutic community. So when we talk about, well, give a talk on the therapeutic community, you have to, at least I appreciate, that there's a lot of different people here who have different levels of understanding and knowledge. My hope is that I can tailor the remarks in such a way where everybody gets a message that's useful to them. For me, that's why I'm in business. Can I be useful or not? So that's very selfish, and that's why I say it's a kind of an apology, because it's, I can always deliver a 25-slide presentation to a certain designated audience, but that's not really what I want to do tonight. But it will require my probably reviewing with some amplification, some of the things you heard from Tim about classical TC, and also a little bit of storytelling, because even if you got veterans around here, we all need to understand the right story of the therapeutic community before we talk about some of the real issues that are now need to be dealt with the modern therapeutic community. So look, it begins this way. You know, I'm thinking 1960, and New York, which is my home base, was ravaged with heroin addiction, probably the fourth cycle of heroin addiction from the turn of the century or a little before then. New York was going crazy with its heroin addiction and its epidemic. And the whole thing didn't become active at all in terms of treatment without crime. Crime drove the whole treatment birth. And that is, it's not that the New York policy people were interested in public health. They were interested in safety, and these addicts were committing crimes and everybody was unsafe. And that's what convinced Nixon and others to begin thinking really about, later on Nixon, but from the early 60s on, why you had to deal with addiction as a problem, because it's so related to crime, you know what I mean? We got such high costs and people were afraid. So obviously the criminal justice system was involved, and that's why we got a series of, policies on crime and locking people up. But there was also a receptivity to treatment. In other words, some of us around in those days would make remarks like, there are things other than simply incarceration and locking people up. There is treatment, but we didn't have a good case for treatment. You got to remember the addiction, what we knew about addiction in 1962 and 63 and 64 is that there was no cure for it, that the relapse rates from Lexington and other places, which were all medically managed, were 93% within the first 30 days after they left treatment. So the issue was we couldn't make a case for treatment based on what existed in the information in treatment. It kind of corroborated the public perception about addiction and addicts and added to the whole 5 decades of stigma that followed from that. Like, who the addicts were and what addiction was. Even in my trade, psychology, and in psychiatry, within that group, the few professionals who were involved in addiction treatment or working with addicts in some way, they also were stigmatic. I remember some of my colleagues would say, what are you working with that population? So it's like a loser population on all levels, you know what I mean? As if they were a dismissible group of needy people. And therefore, the few psychologists and psychiatrists who were involved were kind of on the low end of things. And we were even out of it in terms of our profession. It turns out that even the development of the therapeutic community 10 years earlier in England, which had a different kind of TC, but the psychiatrist involved there, Maxwell Jones, also was a kind of stigmatized psychiatrist because he was interested in British soldiers who were coming back using a lot of drugs, had personality disorder, and launched what he called the democratic therapeutic community. It's a fast historical review for you, but it's a tidbit to have. What I'm getting at is that we had a very difficult population, unliked, unwanted by the society, but driven to do something about it, primarily out of fear, not out of their heart. And the issue was we didn't have anything from mental health that could help at all. We didn't have anything from essentially medicine. Methadone was still an experimental drug, and that was the best that they can do at the time in terms of trying to call it a treatment. And that's what we had. Now, why this part of the story? Because it was the absolute context for the development of this approach. In case you didn't hear something important in that phrase, let me say it again. Society couldn't do anything for the addicts, so they began doing it for themselves. So you say, well, what's dramatic about that? Even though I can get dramatic, as you can hear, but so what's important about that? Well, what's important about that is what came out of the 60s, from Synanon and Delancey and onward, to the first generation of TCs, Phoenix House, Daytop, what I'll call the East Coast TCs. What came out of that was an approach that was being developed, but it had nothing to do with mental health, nothing to do with medicine. The people themselves were developing this. You hear Tim's review in terms of, the classical TCs. Yes, that's when we finally formalize it and can talk about it in terms of how do you teach this approach and so on. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but I just wanted you to give the historical basis for this. I entered the field at that time, a little bit younger than what I am now, you understand? I entered the field then, and what was going on was an approach was being developed. Trial and error, 24/7. Every day they were learning, how do we stay clean? How do we not kill ourselves? No doctors were around to do anything about that. No psychologists, no psychiatrists. Synanon, of course, was the classical example, but it's only the first programs were all, I say, the entire approach was developed by the participants themselves. Not because they had an academic or theoretical basis for this, but on a daily basis, they were discovering the moment-to-moment changes that they needed to keep implementing to keep themselves clean, keep themselves sane, keep themselves nonviolent, and keep themselves from getting into deep depressions. That's the truth at the beginning. So there were no doctors involved in that. They didn't come out of mental health, didn't come out of anything that was central to society. It was an alternative approach, unfunded, and developed by the participants themselves. They made a lot of mistakes along the way also. Fortunately for my life and my career, which gave me a little bit of meaning, I wasn't an addict, but you can see I was involved in jazz, and I was close to circles where I knew it from another perspective. But when I saw it as a psychologist, when Mitchell Rosenthal, late Mitchell Rosenthal, who was a psychiatrist, asked me to come and look at the first year of Phoenix House in New York, he said, come and look and see what's going on here. I walk into a Phoenix House in New York, and that house had 80 residents. The West Side tenement. And there's a front desk. There are men and women dressed up, shirts and ties on the men. The women all turned out. Good morning, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Who do you want to see? I'm looking at people who were ripping and running and essentially on the edge of life, who were now kind of running an organization, you understand, at the front door, greeting people, sign in please, making phone calls, and so. Places to go, things to do, wearing jacket. In those days, you had to wear a jacket, a shirt, and a tie. And there was a reason for that. The public is going to come and look at us, so we have to look right. You can't look like the stigma. You got to look right. So I'm listening and looking as a psychologist, and then of course I had another benefit. I had treated patients, and there was few addicts along the line. And of course, they're untreatable in psychotherapy, so forget about that. Even Freud found that out, even beyond his own cocaine addiction, that the fact that the addict essentially was untreatable. And one reason was that, they would sit them down on the couch while the addict was using, and they'd talk about why he's using. Come back next session, and we'll talk again about why he's using. So that failed. Now I'm looking at people who had lived dark, disturbed lives, who have a good attitude, moving quickly. Nobody was moving slowly. People had things to do. So beyond asking any mental health questions about how how healthy are these people, mental health? I already knew these people were changed. These were changed people. The reason I say that, first of all, it satisfies me. I have to have opportunity. Time's running out in life. You have to have opportunities to essentially say what you got to say. And I knew that it did something for me right away, because I didn't have a good background. I didn't have that kind of background, but I didn't have an easy background. And I saw and could resonate, and if you like, even empathize with the idea that people change. The unchangeable are changing. Now that was, I'm communicating with you in language that is not contrived. That is the way I've always thought about it. I hope that's the energy of that has come through in some of my training and teaching. That's where that energy comes from, because I was transformed myself when I walked into those first days at Phoenix House. And what transformed me was I saw people who were transformed. I began to use that word. I said, this is not treatment, it's transformation. It's okay, a little hyperbolic, but it made the point that it was much more than stopping using a drug. It had to do with their whole energy has changed, the way they're looking at the day, the way they're looking at work, the way they're looking at each other. Now, with that as a beginning, and why it's all relevant to, hopefully, to your questions, which will come soon, why it's a beginning is, it's when I finally committed myself, and I did that pretty quickly within 72 hours, committed myself to saying, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to look at it, I'm going to be part of this in some way. But it wasn't as a psychologist. I wasn't going to sit there and do therapy with these people. They didn't need me for that. It was going on. Now that phrase I ultimately coined as community as method. That reality that I saw, that the therapy was going on through the community. It wasn't going on through counselors. It wasn't even going on through peer counseling. It was going on through many things in the community, which included peers talking to one another. But it was many things going on there. In short, I was trying to understand, once I believed, as I did quickly, that transformation was occurring, then at least as the academic side of me got so stimulated on this, I could ask the question, what the hell is producing that? Why is that happening? You couldn't do that on an individual counseling basis. I still believe that. Individual counseling is not the treatment of choice for serious addiction. It has a place, but it's not the treatment of choice. So the term community as method, a number of the terms that are in the Red Book, I realized I had, it's a little bit, I'm taking a little bow now, so you'll indulge me. I realized that I had to give language to what I thought was unique and powerful about the TC. And the phrase community as method was one of the phrases that I felt was necessary, because the mainstream society would never understand what's going on here unless they asked the question, as the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse asked me, what's the method there? He said, what are they doing there? Is that a church? Is that faith? What are they doing there? I said, no, there is a method. He said, what's the method? I said, well, it's the community. But as slick as that phrase was, I had to essentially empirically describe it, what I meant by that. And I want to do that for you now, even though you may be at different levels of understanding on this. Community as method really has a definition. Watch this. When a program uses its community, that is all of its participants, all of its activities, but mainly its participants, to teach an individual to use the community to change themselves. I tell every new resident, when you come in here, this community exists for you, but we will teach you how to use it. If you use it, you will change. You can find that out for yourself. So the community is a method And essentially, what we really mean by that is the community is teaching the individual to use the community to change the individual. The outcome is the individual, it's not the community. That's why it's not a cult. It's the individual. Once I was able to formulate that as a definition, and I'm hoping you can appreciate it as a definition, you'll come to understand very quickly the next chapter that I'm going to tell you, why it was so powerful. And that is that once individuals were learning how to use the community to change themselves, that means I use every interaction, I use every activity, every group, every meeting, every one-on-one conversation, every group process, every confrontation, I use. Not only that, the power of this approach was even when there was an inner circle of a group that was using it, the outer circle was also benefiting vicariously from it. They had to use it too. So it was also the first treatment that would treat multiple people at the same time. Is this too over the top the way I'm talking? I'm just checking back for feedback. So look, the evolution of the therapeutic community, the so-called classical therapeutic community, I'm trying to now change even your framework of understanding that from this little historical perspective. I believed then, it was a transformative approach, still believe it, it's a transformative approach. I also, and this was part of my own ego needs, and we can have another conversation about that, if you want that, but I wanted to essentially, basically advance this approach in the world. Why? Because it worked. So the next question that I addressed on this was to provide data that it worked. So we did the first outcome studies early on in the late 60s and early 70s, which were big studies. They were big, 500, 600, 700 people that we followed out over the years and found, and this part, everybody in the room has to know this finding, because you can't be interested in this field without knowing this, whatever science has come about to document it. And that is, when we looked at our people who came through treatment and looked at them 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 12 years later, those kinds of studies, what you found was a very simple rule. The longer they had stayed in a place like Phoenix House, the better they looked 5 years later. Success, if you want to use that, no drugs, no crime, fully employed, success was directly related to how long they stayed in treatment. So we published those first outcome studies as retention produces outcomes. Everything was keeping people in the process, keep them in the process. If they stay in the process long enough, you'll start to see the payoff. That was the first profound insight. The issue of fidelity as a specific issue, which I'm leading up to, was yes, that will occur if that program is a high fidelity program, if they're doing it right. One is, if they weren't a high fidelity program, they were going to have astronomical dropout anyway. And even in a high fidelity program, you're going to have high dropouts because it's a high demand approach in community-based TCs. So the second major kind of fact that you have to consider when you're doing this work is that we had now decades of research that showed that the longer that people stayed in these approaches, the better they did in terms of real successful outcomes. And in fact, if those programs were more or less high fidelity, doing it in the word fidelity, as I'll come back to in a moment, means faithful to. As long as the approach, the program was faithful to its, what we'll call the principles and the model, if you like, the theory. Remember, it didn't begin as a theory, but it did need a theory as we went on in terms of moving it into the culture wide. We had to be able to explain what we were doing and why we're doing it. You couldn't simply say we were transformed. So the phrase community method means a distinctive social psychological approach in which essentially the community teaches individuals to use every activity, every interaction, everything we do in the TC to learn and change themselves. It's a good program if that's going on. When I have to go out and assess therapeutic communities, I look for how much of that is going on. How much, and of course the key word is participation. If individuals are in fact engaged in it, even if you don't want to engage in it, the whole act as if principle we should come back to see how potent that is. But even if you don't like it or don't even believe it, you do it anyway. Why? Not to essentially to be authoritarian over you, because there's a profound psychological truth in this. If you participate, you give yourself the opportunity to see whether you will change. And if you change, that becomes the reinforcement for continued participation. That's why we see the conversion rates around 6 months. People who last in the long-term TC, around 6 months, they start to begin to buy into the program. The first 4 to 6 months, they're doing everything else. But by 6 months, something's happened to them. Something changed. Incidentally, the first change is, this is when I'm doing now straight training and saying, how do you improve early retention? Make sure that early on in the first days, our new people are always seeing other people just like themselves who've changed. The first change that we see is you changed. That immediately raises the possibility that I can change. So when now we talk about the word, I want to move now, if I haven't been too disjointed in this kind of a free association approach, I want to go to the word fidelity with a little bit more depth. And intellectually, I want to get it so that you understand it to the point where you can appreciate it to a certain extent as much as I appreciate it, because it's a very satisfying experience. Fidelity, it's another term that I introduced to the field. Incidentally, again, I'm taking unnecessary bows, but I have to do it. The issue is, we needed the language that was, as I say, to communicate to all levels of society what we did, that it was not a mystery. But it was complex, but it's not a mystery. In fact, it's so much not a mystery that as I got later in my career, along with other colleagues, I was able to show, along with a lot of other people, that a lot of what the TC was discovering by itself, which it did, essentially was consistent with what was going on in some good psychological work that was going on in the world. Very consistent with a lot of psychological principles. There's a lot that was occurring, except that TCs didn't learn it from the world. They discovered it from the trial and error process of their own change experiences. So I always say, look, don't ignore a lot of the social psychological research, which is not TC research, because it contains a lot of information that says those elements, those conventional social psychological elements, like role playing, that's a social psychological term, wasn't invented in the TC, it was outside, but in the TC it's a central concept, right? Role playing is a central concept. Because they discovered it that way, not because some social psychologist came in and told them to do it. When you see that convergence of truth or consistency, you start to believe in the truth. What we're doing is truthful. Good things happen out in the world, and good things were discovered in the TC. Fidelity. The big factor in studying and understanding fidelity and understanding the original elements, as Tim was trying to go over with you, and there's more to say about that, is that it has to be implemented properly. And this was the big challenge that TCs, as they became successful, accepted more or less in the community, in public health, and so the government was willing to fund them and so on. We all thought that was great, that we're not being funded. Of course, from day one, I and others saw there was a great threat to the approach because of that. We can come back to that. It's a political discussion. But the idea is okay, now that we got an approach that seems to work, the research shows that it worked, or I have to tell you though, that a lot of my contemporary scientists in addiction treatment still were very critical of the TC and critical even of my work, not with me so much, but my work and other outcome researchers, because we weren't able to run classical double-blind, you know what I mean, outcome studies, because of a lot of complex issues why you couldn't do those things. And because, you know, if you couldn't run a study, a double-blind clinical trial study, it was worthless to them. It was, you know, it was kind of hearsay. It was not compelling to them. The TC still suffer from that because we don't have enough of those clinical trials, and there's a lot of good reasons why we don't. But it's always been a struggle, even on the research end. And now to double back on this, the fact that I was able to survive 40 years of research funding tells me, well, they still accepted it anyway. You know what I mean? They still went with it anyway. Why? Because in the TC outcome studies, and you should know this too, around the world, long-term TCs, thousands and thousands of people have been followed over some 30 or 40 years, and you get the same outcomes. The longer they're in, the better they do, and the better the program, the better they'll do. So it was the consistency of outcomes that kept it alive, not simply the elegance of the methodology. That's still challenged. That's why we don't even get a lot of public broadcasting about TCs as effective evidence-based treatments. I always have to make that case again and again, even with my colleagues. It's certainly evidence-based. We have a lot of evidence if you don't ignore it. All right, you're indulging me a little bit because those are some of the footnotes in my life. But so here's the idea. For those of you in the room that are at various stages of exploring this, we have sophisticated people who've been doing it for years, and you've got newer people who are coming in. It is not an approach to observe, leave, rip, and run. It's not an approach to do that. Here's what I recommend to minimize the error of infidelity. And that is, if you're interested in the therapeutic community approach, you can't simply pick and choose this olive, this tomato, and so on, and say, I'm going to use this, I'm going to have a peer group. You have to understand this is a very powerful approach, but it has to be essentially implemented properly. You got to understand, that's why I'm repeating this community, what does community's method really mean? And you have to essentially be able to, you yourself know it, preferably by experience. That's why a lot of the early professionals, non-addict professionals who got into the TC business like myself, were also essentially members of the community. Our position there was not some hierarchical authoritarian position. It was members of the community. I happened to be a psychologist who did research. That was my job function. And so I sat in the community and would sit in groups. And so we all went through some part of that experience. We didn't do it in the way the residents have to do it every day for some period of time. You have to commit yourself then to saying it's a powerful approach, at least intellectually try to understand it, which is a little bit part of my work and objective tonight. But then you got to be true to it. You got to say, are we really doing it? And so what follows a session like this, which is a teaching session at best, is training. This is a teaching. This is not a training. It's a teaching. It's training. And that is, how do you really ensure that you can have a high fidelity program? Well, of course, it's through training. And to begin to give you the sense of how that training would occur, and you can now think about this in terms of your own interests. It's, you're deciding, well, how do you go about training? And I can give you something I always deliver to all residents, and that every element of the TC, every activity, planned, formal, unplanned, and informal, that we have in a therapeutic community has a purpose. So when you walk into a TOSA or you walk into any program, if you were an educated person on this, you would be looking, as I try to look, said, yes, they're running a morning meeting. How is that morning meeting going? Why? Well, that's a typical activity. It's an everyday activity in a therapeutic community. You say, well, we do it. Looks like morning meeting in the Marine Corps also. There are morning meetings and morning meetings. There's nothing original about morning meetings. So what is it doing in a TC? It has a purpose. Somebody tell me what's the purpose of the morning meeting in the TC? Dave, I want to hold you off on this. Go all the way in the back. Bring the group together. Okay, got another one? Go ahead. What? Say it louder. I'm not sure I heard it clearly. That may be me. Say again?
Start the day on a positive note.
Good. Start the day on a positive note. Well, every civilian knows that. We like to start the day on a positive note. This is a necessary activity in the therapeutic community. It must go on. Remember, they discovered in the early days, as I said, on a daily trial and error basis, the things that they have to do every day to essentially keep that program healthy, even if they had no theory about it, right? They were learning it by essentially by activity itself. Why is it that the morning meeting has to be done every day and be successful? Why? Go ahead. Strengthen the what? Strengthen the sense of community, right? Well, he says responsibility, accountability, it's already a high demand for a morning meeting. How do you mean?
They're becoming responsible.
Oh, yes, okay, they're becoming, the routine is helping them become punctual and accountable, and that's it. But go ahead in here. Create a routine. Yes, routine is important, repetition is important in the TC, but why? Why is it important? See? What? Consistency. Go ahead, I see a hand up. That's right. So all of you have a particle of the truth on this. That's right. But you can see my own hesitancy around your responses. Where I want to go with this, and where I have gone with this, even with some of my psychiatric colleagues who don't understand the therapeutic community, why a well-run morning meeting is a necessity for this client population. What? Right. Does set a standard, but why in this population? Well, you're kind of circling around. But start on a positive note. We know why we want everybody to start on a positive note. But what you're hearing me labor with is this phrase where I said everything we do has a purpose. And what you've described is, yes, those are all valid, what you're saying, but are they potent, purposeful statements? That's true for any morning meeting. Why does this population have to have it work? And why do they need this tone set for the day? What? So you now watch it now. Had you heard that sets the tone for a day? Why this population essentially has to have a successful morning meeting? Because, go ahead, Doug. You hear that? Now what I'm getting at, it's not that you've been wrong. I want you to see the connection between every activity has a purpose. And that purpose means it's something we know about this client's disorder and why we are treating that disorder. This population is particularly susceptible to get into trouble. with their mood alterations, both drug-induced and psychologically induced. In that way, we are like a conventional treatment. When I talk to psychiatrists and psychologists, I'm saying one way you got to treat the mood issues in addiction is that they've got to be constantly around positive, high stimulating push so they don't drift. But that's like saying, okay, that's like psychotherapy, right? And yes, it is like psychotherapy. But it's community mediated. It's in community. If I use the community, it has the power that no individual counselor can have. My being affiliated with this community is already doing things to me that I need done to me. I'm getting a lot of davening here, but does that mean yes? Look, I'm keeping myself stimulated, forgive me on this, and this is the way I try to do it. As long as I'll last, I may faint in a few minutes, but we'll see what happens. But the point I'm making is I'm trying to drive home community as method, a distinctive approach where the community is the means by which people change. And that means the opening statement about that I hope you will write down and take away, is that every activity, if you're going to set up a program and you think it's a classical program, and you think all of those elements can be listed, and they can, then you've got to answer another question. You can't simply have the list. You've got to know why I'm doing it. You'll never be able to convince a resident about why you're doing it unless you really know why we're doing it. And it's not simply because we can get together every day. Yes, that's all true. That helps. But that's simply a community in motion. We are addressing something about the client and the disorder and recovery in every activity. We are addressing something about the client, the disorder, and their recovery. That's what that activity is intended to do. If you can't explain that to a client, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know why we're running it. There's a lot of TCs that finally get out of order. Their answer to why we're running is that that's the way we always did it. That's the way they did it when I came out of treatment. And I would ask them, why do you do that? They couldn't articulate, some couldn't articulate clearly what the real purpose of the morning meeting was. I hope I haven't essentially beat this point down, but if we were spending a lot of time together and we were now moving from teaching toward training, we would be going over every single activity that way. Why do we run a business meeting? We have 3 community meetings a day as the minimum. The whole community comes together 3 times a day. Why? One is the morning meeting. We have that launch. Then in the old days, we used to have somewhere during the day a seminar every day that brought the whole community together. Then in the evening, we had a business meeting. They might have called it something else, but it was a business meeting. Why did we need that meeting? Well, of course, there were pragmatic issues to deal with in every one of those meetings. But if you introduce the criterion of, well, what's educational or therapeutic about a business meeting? What are we addressing about the client, the disorder, and recovery with a business meeting? When I attend TCs for assessment and I watch their business meetings, I watch to see if what they're doing is having a certain impact on the community at large. If I've got a community in the evening now thinking about the management concerns of this community, the residents thinking about the management concerns, that the health and safety of this community is really the business meeting in one form or another. We got to go over all those issues. We make announcements and so on. Is this working? Is the laundry working? And so on. We go through all of that stuff. Why? Well, you got to run that in any healthy community. That's true. We don't run that, we don't have a healthy community. So that by definition, you have to have the meeting. But I'm still looking for what's the therapeutic and educational impact on the client? Any ideas about that? I'm moving from the morning meeting to the business meeting for a moment just to continue to make this point. That's the hardest one to justify. You got a point? Course correction is good. That's right. We can catch problems. We can change things. But why does this client have to experience that in this way? Right. Do our clients have good histories of organized, essentially thinking in their own lives, of planning, of reviewing the past and planning ahead? They don't. You put them in positions in the evening, essentially some kind of a management contributing role. They got to think about these problems. How do we solve this house problem? How do we handle a leaking retention rate? What I'm getting at, and again, I'm maybe overselling it, but the point I'm making is every activity is got to be there, should be present. It's not sacred. They're very common activities. They exist in a lot of organizations. We use them in a different way, which is all about essentially how do these activities impact the individual in terms of who they are, in terms of their characteristics, their disorder, if you like, and their recovery. If you can't answer that question, you don't know what you're doing. You think you're running a program or it's running itself. A lot of people will conclude that. But they're rote activities. They can easily become very stilted. They can easily go off course. And if you can't appreciate that, that's not only a level of disorganization, but now you're in a time-wasting issue, which is all the secondary problems of boredom that start to occur. If things don't look like they're really valid, they're authentic. I'm talking about fidelity, but I'm trying to talk about it at a base level so that whoever you are in the room, wherever you're working in, whatever program you're in, and whatever level that is, this is the meaning of fidelity. Do I have all of the elements that essentially will assure a healthy community will continue as a community? And but we're really in the business of simply not continuing communities. We're in the business of having community help the individual change themselves. That's the ultimate outcome. Well, look, let me just stop for a moment. What time is it? Am I talking how long? That is like kind of nonstop. What, half hour or so, you think? Is it that much? 45 minutes. Okay. Let me stop then for a moment. I think I need to hear a little bit from you, and I need to hear a little feedback. So why don't we, yeah, good. So this is not the end of it all, but let's just see if we can move productively. If we begin either an out-and-out Q&A, we can do that. If you want to make some comments, okay, I just don't want them to go too long in terms of just comments. Questions, yes.
Okay, wait for the microphone.
Dr. De Leon, I don't know if I have a question yet, but I just want to say what blew my mind around buying more into the therapeutic community is the fact that it has the ability to treat multiple people at a time. So even the active inner group certainly is being helped, but to think about the outer observer also being impacted by what's happening, I think that just really blew my mind a bit more as an advocate for the value of this and how many people are being helped versus buying into some one-to-one approach with so many people being sick and struggling.
Listen, I greatly appreciate your response to that, because when I've had to sell the therapeutic community approach, years ago, I said, this point needs to be made. When communities are essentially used as methods, they are capable of treating large numbers of people at a time. Think about that. Just think about that in terms of if I get 80, 90 people in a house and we're running a program and producing change in that program, The cost benefit, the inherent cost benefit of that is profound. This is what they discovered about the early universities. Look at this. You have a mass education. We can transform the society because of how many people we get educated. TCs do that. I say they're really closer to teaching and education than they are to treatment. So it's a profound point, but from the psychological point of view, here's the exotic part. Remember, I'm a psychologist, so in the end, what really appealed to me was, you know what? There's a powerful encounter group going on here tonight. There's 10 people in this circle. They're talking and they're into it and they're doing it right. And you got another 20 people who are looking at it. What's happening to them? Most of the therapeutic change that occurs in therapeutic communities is vicariously mediated. They not only have direct experience themselves with an interaction, but they're constantly seeing other interactions that are affecting them. Vicarious. I learn at a distance. It's like watching my father beat up my brother and what that did to me. That's how powerful a community approach can be when it's run right. I never worry about the fact that you got 10, 12 people in the circle, but I worry about how the circle is functioning. Because I got people in the fifth row back there, like AA learned a long time ago, they said they got people all the way in the back. If they're seeing this circle and things are happening in that circle, things are happening to them. And my final other analogy for this is all DeLeon talking now for the moment, again, allow me this. It's like great theater. Why is theater, when theater is great, why is it great? Because what goes on the stage is affecting 1,000 people sitting there. We use that vicarious learning, which is a fundamental principle in the TC. Why people change? The principle of vicarious learning. They are learning to alter the way they think, the way they feel on the basis of what they saw over there. When it's run right, not guaranteed. So thank you for reminding us of that, because you can see it turned me on a little bit again. I got going again on this. Some other either cue or questions or comments, please.
I get in my head a lot and I spin a lot of stories. What's your personal belief or your personal opinion? What's best on battling false beliefs in our subconscious?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it very well. Can we repeat? He's talking about himself or some,
Yeah, inside my own head. So what's your personal opinion on battling, or what's most valuable to you in battling those false statements?
False statements, you mean in beliefs?
Yeah, in your subconscious.
You have one example that comes to mind quickly? One example of that?
So spinning stories in my head. So like leaving a back door open, or false statements, false beliefs that, I'm not enough, or like I'm not enough and giving up on myself.
That's one of those statements that runs through your head like that, right? I'm not enough. So now your question is, why do I do it, or how do I stop it, or what? Look, I think I understand what you want to hear in this, but I'll address it this way. If that's occurring, those what you call these false statements, a reliable antidote to that is to make it real. Say that to somebody, but say it in the form of a question. This is my thought. I'm whatever that statement is, that self-referred statement, you now have to present it to a peer, someone next to you, and see if they will corroborate that. So reality tested is the suggestion I'm making. Does that make any sense to you? Other.
Hey, I had a question. What kills the TC? What have you seen kill TCs in regards to maybe leaving the classic model and turning into something else that's not a TC?
Yeah.
And what kills a TC in regards to kind of just shutting down almost,
Well, kills is rough, it's a rough word, kills the TC, but I'm in agreement with you that over 60 years, the arc of the TC has started to rise and has been declining, and the factors that contribute to that are pretty clear to me, and I've been writing about it for on and off for a number of years about what those issues are. The first step is when the TC moved from a self-reliant endeavor, which is TOSA, and moved to go into regular public health and try to simply be financed by public health, which essentially then meant not that public health is so bad, but public health has a different set of principles that govern what they're doing. And part of that is if they're going to pay you money, but you got to pay attention to their principles and their regulations, you married the wrong spouse on this. And that is in the sense that the issue is that once I bend myself out of shape to meet what you're doing, you got to have a psychiatrist over here. You have to have a nurse also. When I launched a program in Bellevue Hospital, they were trying to tell me how many doctors I needed or not and how many nurses. I was successful along with the chief of psychiatry to save me on that by saying, get everybody out, just give me one good nurse. And that's all I need, because the nurse is a very powerful member of the community when he or she essentially knows what she's doing or he's doing in a therapeutic community model. So one issue was the issue of public money. And TCs, incidentally, are partly responsible for their downfall on this because they wanted to do that. Once the first generation of programs that resulted in the Phoenix houses and the Daytops and so on, they immediately started to move toward public money. They moved away from social enterprise and generating their own independence because they wanted safety, security, and status. So the question was, it was the TC's own ego contribution to this that was part of the problem. I used to kind of yell. As a matter of fact, it's one of the reasons I left Phoenix House after 20 years, because they want to expand even more and faster. You understand that at the price of the fidelity of the program, of the approach. So the issue of public, it's a paradoxical issue. I also want public health to change. I want to see therapeutic communities somehow transform society. So that was my madness around this also, I'd like to see what can happen there. I wasn't convinced to leave it as an alternative treatment. I thought it was the treatment myself. So that's where I got sick, for a little bit of while. The other thing is that even in the long-term TCs, even if they were funded, there seems to be an inherent entropic process over generations. And that is a program, an approach like a high-energy therapeutic community running itself with enthusiasm and confidence is hard to see it get transmitted generation by generation. It almost as if you have to reinvent the TC for every new generation. They've got to rediscover it themselves. And to sustain that early launch energy, you understand, that essentially gives it a certain confidence. It may be a very profound issue. That is, you're destined to begin declining and losing fidelity. So one issue essentially is when they ask me to help them launch, let's say, prison TCs or TCs in other settings, I always say, give me 8, 9, 10 good women, 10 good men. That's all. Just give me those 10. And let them run it. When we ran the first homeless TC, I said, let them run it on the top floor of the shelter. There was a shelter that had several floors. Let them run their own program up there. Same people, but they're running it up there. They're running it. I got 10 of those people. And let the rest of the population, the homeless population, either leave the residence entirely or join forces. So that is the right way actually to launch. That's the most efficacious way to launch any TC. You never run it big. You come in with your first 10 people. You got, as Dave was saying earlier, you got to have total commitment. Everybody's got to be turned on to this. But not only that, they really need to be educated. Now at least we have a generation where we've got literature. We can now talk about it the way we talk about it. It's easy to transmit now the real concepts, like you're hearing tonight. So does that help your question about when you say you killed?
Yeah, thank you. Yep.
So you kind of touched on it just a second ago, but I want to know how much like social influence drives the success in the therapeutic community. Like, so in comparison with like an individual therapy, or I feel like we've hit a sweet spot here with the amount of students we have. And I was talking to somebody from an organization that was a lot larger, do you think it gets watered down at a certain point, or how important is the social influence? You know, I know with morning meetings, I know that to align people with the same common long-term goals and objectives has a social influence factor in there. How, like, do you think growing to a larger population would be detrimental, or does that have any correlation?
The last couple of sentences, the one I'm trying to follow, is relating, you mean to the macro society you're talking about when you say that?
Yeah, just a community with say 400 people as opposed to the 120. It feels like a family here, and if it gets larger like that, and it's you know, nothing's quite as personal, is that
That's
is
a
a hindrance?
that factor you're saying, and that's a good point. There was the whole issue of the size of programs themselves, and I'm grateful that you brought that up. And there's another related point that I didn't say, which is a darker one, which is the abuse of TCs. And I want to come back to that one in a moment, but so someone remind me, it doesn't slip away. But you're absolutely right. We struggled in the early years, in the expansion years, of getting bigger and bigger, not only in terms of public funding, but how much the size of the program itself. On Long Island City, we had one facility with 270 people in that facility. Ask yourself, how do you keep community going with 270 people in one facility? It's almost like a prison, but it was a community-based facility. It was an old hospital. You know what I mean? And they were running in that terms. And there's no question about that. We finally kind of, without a lot of research, concluded that there was probably an optimal level for running a pure community as method approach, where you can assure that the front and back side of that is not going to get too extended, where we're going to be essentially running estrangement and alienation as a probability, right around 80 to 100. So even if you're an organization that's running a big program, it looks like ideally you want essentially units of max out at 80 or 90 or 100 to assure, it's not written in stone, but that's where we clinically kind of came to and said, you know, this looks like this is all manageable. You can keep all of the intimacy of the community, face-to-face interview of the community, and all of the activities can be covered, and all the management concerns are much more managed in that respect. But that every organization settles that for itself, depending on their ambitions. But my sense is that it's a very good point. And if we had our druthers, you'd rather talk about small colonies. And one good example was the Chicago prison where, why am I forgetting it? Sheridan in Chicago, for some of you that may remember that. That was a very ambitious program. That was 1,200 prison population. And what they finally broke it out to was like maybe they were running like 4 parallel programs in there. And there was community and then mega community, you know, so to speak, but they were able to basically run a TC day successfully if they held it at 90 in the unit and essentially achieved that, and then identified with the larger project in that respect. So there were some solutions that were tried around that. The other point that I don't want to forget is the abusive point, because it had to do with what was another factor that essentially affected the course of the trajectory of the TC. And this is a terrible one, and you need to hear this one. It's not unrelated to the whole discussion of fidelity. As a matter of fact, it illustrates when you don't have fidelity. And the issue was the number of programs that launched themselves as TCs, called themselves TCs, and even had TC experienced people, dropouts and others, you understand, people had 3 months experience in it, a couple of long-term people, but mostly, you know, others. And they launched programs because of whatever their personality strengths were and so on. This was one of the unfortunate developments in the whole therapeutic community movement, which was too many people who simply had not gone through a long enough process of change to basically head off their own risk factors, put them in situations where they're now launchers and captains of the ship. You're going to have a high potential for abuse, because that in itself puts them into a social situation which encourages a certain the role of authoritarianism and so on. So there's a long story about that, and it's fundamentally an accurate story, just overstated in the public media And that's the real word. The word killing came there because there was a lot of terrible literature that came out about that. But there had some fundamental truth to it. That is that there were programs that were abusive programs. You know, a person had 5 months of TC experience, came in and started yelling at all the clients, all the residents, and thought that the whole treatment, that confrontation was shouting and yelling at each other all the time. And never understanding that the word confront only meant face to face. That's all the word confront meant. But they borrowed it from the labor union. No, confront meant we got to defeat the money classes. You understand? You had to essentially attack them. You had the whole wrong concept of confrontation.
All right. Hi. You answered one of my questions I was thinking about. If the TC gets extremely big, you mentioned parallel. So you can have like a group of 80 and another group of 80 and another group of 80, and that'll keep the family unity still involved. And then the other thing is TOSA, we have like a risk factor. Like any little thing we do out there in the public eye could ruin our standing. So that little factor makes us act 120 to 150% better when we're in front of others. And I was just thinking your point of view on that.
The failure of one unit may affect the whole organization. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, it's a risk factor.
If we're okay, I want to be sensitive to those who've come a long ways. Maybe we can take 2 more questions, if that's all right.
I mean, as long as I'm holding up, and you got to tell me, you know, I can.
So my question is, so every individual participant who is in these process or programs,
Can you speak a bit louder, sir?
every individual who are in the process and in these programs, they need special care. So every individual, I know there's a basic foundation and principles, excuse me, and principles set. However, those special individuals who need those care, is there a way to give them those therapeutic techniques they need or special care?
Special individuals, is that the phrase I heard? What's an example of a special individual, so I know who you're referring to?
Learning deficiencies,
Oh.
mental disabilities, so on and so forth.
Okay. So thank you for that. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. That was his question represents another great challenge to the TC over these 60 years of its existence, modern existence. And that is when we began to stretch out and expand, it was not only to reach conventional community-based addicts, but special populations, you know, who had not only addiction or substance abuse as their problem, or even criminality as their problem, but they might have had other mental health issues, they might have had developmental issues, and so on. TCs, remember, fundamentally, I've always said to our field, we're a risky field because we have egos that can be very disturbed. We can get very expansive egos. You know, a lot of the early leaders in the TC were risky people themselves, and they could essentially think we can solve the world. You know, I mean, just give us the world and we'll solve it. And it was no easy matter to begin saying we can take on a dual diagnosed client, you know, or we can take on a developmental disorder. I went to Switzerland at one point where the entire program was called itself a therapeutic community, and the entire population was deaf. And the issue was, what was the adaptations? You know, how do you run therapeutic communities? It was more an education for me than I gave to them in terms of seeing what they were doing. So this issue of taking that on transformed itself into a separate movement in the evolution of TC called the modified TC. And the modified TC showed an awareness that we not only had substance abuse as a problem, but we had these other problems. And therefore, the question on the table was, how much can you still run a kind of classical TC and still be able to deal with these other problems? And that was empirically more or less solved when we tried some of those programs and tried them with the right attitude. And the right attitude was, of course, if there are other problems, you got to have staff people who understand those problems. You can't simply leave that to the regular staff, whatever that staff might be. If you have other special populations, you have to have capability of dealing with those manifestations of those issues. Once you have that, then you have special training problems of how do you integrate that staff into the traditional TC staff, which is doable. We had successful examples of modified TCs, both in prisons, where you had to retrain the whole custody officers and so on. And we had them in hospitals, mental health. I did it at Bellevue, you know what I mean? We had it in mental hospitals. So we gradually, on a step-by-step basis, we're able to see, and here's some of the striking findings. We ran a classical TC. What changed was intensity. The issue was not really what the activity was. We ran the morning meeting, but we didn't have the same expectations. We ran the group process, but we didn't have this expectations. For example, even with some severe schizophrenics. So I was training schizophrenics in the afternoon about simply how to make eye contact with somebody across the room and have person A tell person B that they didn't like what they said to them this morning in the dining room. Now that was basically a confrontation, you know what I mean, and as it was, but intensity was low. The skill that I was trying to teach them was they had a way of, they can communicate this and somehow something good will happen as a result of that communication. But that's a quick clinical example, which was real, to talk about, you know, how do you make these modifications? So I always then went around convinced, saying, you know, with the proper training and understanding of now both populations, you can be successful if you introduce the right modifications, but certainly introduce the term modification, that this is a TC, modified TC. Then I got very excited, and I want you to get excited about it. It is always true, however, when you can get the patient, the client, the resident, the participant involved in the management of their own change at whatever level. That's the governing principle. How do you get them involved in the management of their own change so that you're not making the change for them as it's some authority figure, but they are making changes on the basis of how they actually change. So now if they talk to you about, I didn't like what you said to me this morning, and he answers back and says something along the lines, okay, but you know, you did this and so on. Already you're empowering the client essentially to enter their own change process. That's the kind of governing underlying principle in all of these populations, no matter how deficited they are. I walked on to Ward's Island, where there was a lot of sleepy, medicated, psychotic substance abusers. And by definition, I already saw this place is finished. Everybody's asleep here. There's nothing happening. How can anybody change if everybody's asleep here? And so that immediately, there was a couple of like-minded, people on their staff. I said, you got to get them up. You let them have a community meeting, have them talk. You gave them some TC elements to do and carry out. The moment they did that, the ward changed in energy. The patients started to get up and walk around and talk to one another. And already that's change. When you see change, change begins to foster hope. When you have hope, you get more change.
Okay, let's take one last question.
Dr. De Leon, my whole self and my whole person just overflows with gratitude for who you are, and what you've offered us, and how you've influenced us all as the expert in this space. My final comment and question to you comes from a statement you made about the first change I see is that you changed. And I was wondering if you can just hearken back to the value or the impact of having that shared lived experience with the person that walks in on day one, and as a somewhat of a deterrent for maybe others who might want to start a therapeutic community, lead a therapeutic community, be involved, but don't have that shared lived experience. So when you said the first change I see is I see that you changed, it hearkened me to think about the power of the peer association and the lived experience. Could you speak more to that again?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And the reason why I tell that story, why I concluded that this phrase is that one of the first change interventions particularly for the early new resident who comes in, one intervention is they should see someone exactly more or less like them who are walking and talking differently. And frequently, where I learned that is that in the induction facility in Phoenix House, the first facility they go in, there were 2-month residents who were ripping and running 10 blocks away in New York City, who were now in the program 2 or 3 months, and now essentially with all the tattoos and everything, but all now walking and talking and behaving respectfully and cordially. And now someone comes in and sees there was somebody even ripping and running with on the street and seeing him, what he looked like. And at first, of course, they don't believe him. They think he's full of shit or something like that. And then finally the doubt begins to disappear, and they say, something happened to him. And if something can happen to him, maybe it can happen to me. So what I'm getting at is the use of the awareness is that the change possibility, you have to look at what's every element of the TC. One of the earliest elements is just seeing other individuals that look like me, that maybe I even knew on the street, and they changed. Even if they didn't change dramatically, they know they're already different, because once I see that change, then it's hard to deny that change is possible. You can begin saying it's possible. And then do a seminar on it to reinforce it. Like I'm trying to do with you now, a little mini seminar on that piece.
Any last words you want to give before to
Last
conclude?
words is a dangerous phrase for a guy like me, but don't. But listen, there's something you all know in TCs, and that is feedback is a big issue. And I always seek feedback for both ego needs, but also pragmatic needs. And as I'm always trying to see what I can learn from what we've just gone through together, what I did, what you did, and see if it's useful. So my first question is just 3 to 5 minutes of feedback, which is no more questions now, because I guess we stopped the questions, but feedback. And what do you think about this session today? Honest feedback, as you know, TC is all about honesty. Yes.
I was thinking about this, and it makes me think of when there was a gold rush in California. Obviously wasn't old enough, but from reading about it, it's like everybody flocked towards it, and it was this big thing because it involved money. And I just feel that these places are a new gold rush made from love, and instead of just being out of fear, from like you were saying, these were created out of fear in the beginning. I think it's starting to mold into a place of love for the fellow man to love each other and help each other rise to the best person they can be.
Not sure I heard it all, but that's probably part of my problem in terms of hearing it all. But were you able to get it all, Tim?
He said, it seems like there's a reemergence of places of TCs that people are flocking to because, and they're no longer built out of fear, but built out of love. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I do see signs of reemergence, and that has absolutely encouraged me. But look, I don't want to go through another cycle that I already understand, have lived, in all of its detail. I want us to learn from the first 60 years, you understand, and how to move forward. I don't want to go back to day one. I want to move beyond day one, you understand, beyond 60 years, and use what we've learned so that if we've got an opening in the culture, if we've got an opening going on, we should take advantage of it in the right word, in the right sense of that word. That we've learned something from 60 years, and you've been hearing some of the basic things that we've learned. You got to know what this is, and you got to practice it with fidelity, and you have to essentially allow yourself to have full commitment to the whole endeavor.
I got a statement.
Feedback.
Yeah, stand up.
Okay, from the very beginning when I first got here, within the first week or two of being here, I was seeing something that was, to me, quite amazing. And I had a question of where did this whole concept and idea of a TC come from? And what you've given me tonight has answered the question beautifully.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate what you've said here tonight. I'm a third-year student in a therapeutic community out in Pennsylvania. wanting to be involved for a longer period of time and not entirely knowing what that takes. And a lot of those questions have begun being answered here, and I now have resources to learn more about what I need to do as a person to make sure that what we have started in Pennsylvania can continue going and grow to where it needs to. So I thank you for what you've said and for helping me have some more direction.
It's meaningful to me. I appreciate that. If it will help you, then I'm gratified. This is all about me, not about you now. I got it. Thank you for that.
Dr. De Leon, first off, I just want to express the gratitude, and I believe I speak for all of us in the room, for your time and the wisdom and insight that you have brought in us. The part that stuck out to me the most was what you had mentioned about the morning meeting and the cause for it in a TC, about the client and the disorder and their recovery, and just keeping them on I guess you could say, a mental stability through constant routine. And I just appreciate the information that I'm gathering tonight. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that. All the way in the back, you got some?
Yeah.
So my feedback would be that after being here and a 2-year student at TOSA, there's still things that I wasn't quite sure about, and now I see the importance of having you up there explaining it. So like you asked the questions, and if they didn't have that proper answer, then they wouldn't know what they was doing. So that just puts things a lot more into perspective to those of us who has taken the time and is putting in the work for that whole person change to take place, and seeing that in others and then seeing that in themselves. So your feedback was absolutely phenomenal as far as filling in the gaps of all those little things that maybe didn't make sense until this very moment.
That's great. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Hey, listen, I'd like this to keep going on. Remember, feedback doesn't only mean favorable. I'm sensitive, but I'm not fragile. You understand that? But so you may, you can say, you can give me a few pinches if you need to do that. But
I'm sorry, I have no critique this evening, but I would like to say, as someone who's been affiliated with one of the older TCs for a long decades, I think this was a perfect way to kick things off, because you have people here that are interested in the model, interested in developing the model, and you have other people here that are already operating the model to good effect. And you approach this with, we've defined what the model is, we've talked about the components, and you focused those of us that have been doing this a while on the issue of fidelity. And after nearly 30 years of working in a TC, I have seen ebbs and flows that are challenges to fidelity. Things get watered down, they have to be reeled back in. Things begin to happen, and you ask people, why are we doing this? And they don't know why. So you brought up some very, very important parts to creating the TC longevity. So there's something good, from my perspective, there's something good in this for everyone involved here. So I thank you for that. And I was telling my colleague, it's worth it to come here just to hear what you have to say, because you're kind of the authority on this. So thank you for coming.
thank you. Thank you for that.
Let's take one more feedback, and then if it's okay, we'll wrap it up.
Sure.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and wrap it up.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 8:30.
Okay.
Do you think the size of the community and the frequency of meeting, do they need to live together?
Yeah.